a young man can find purpose in laying his life down for the King, and King Jesus. And this is what the church offers young men, that we need to say, listen, we have something worth dying for. We have a cause. We have ground to take. We have something that is beautiful and magnificent and is life-giving more than anything that is behind a screen, more than anything that you're struggling with. The gospel of Jesus Christ is worth dying for. And I feel like we've got to do a better job at communicating that no matter where you look or what you're looking for, that Jesus is better. Well, hey there, and thanks for listening to the Impactus Young Man's podcast, where we help young men become, grow, and live as disciples of Jesus and help them navigate what it means to live as a Christian man in today's cultural moment. Now, every now and then you hear someone talk about how young men are in a crisis, or the fact that young men seem to be doing poorly. While that may seem to be a generalization, we know that not all men are struggling, but we have to ask ourselves this question: is there something to this claim? Are young men really struggling? And if so, why? And what's the solution? Well, on today's podcast, I'm joined by my good friend, Andrew Wood, and we're reacting to a podcast between leadership expert Carey Nieuwhof and his guest, Scott Galloway. Together, they had an interesting discussion about the state of young men in the U.S. and a number of things. So Andrew and I thought it would be interesting to have a conversation around some of Scott's ideas. Now, some things for you to know before we jump in. Scott Galloway is a professor of marketing, author, and a podcast host out of the U.S. Scott doesn't come from a Christian worldview, so his solutions, his evaluation of the topic don't reflect that. Our conversation is in no way an endorsement of his economics, his politics, or his views. At the same time, there's some really interesting ideas here that we're worth wrestling with. So we hope you enjoy as Andrew and I process his comments and what we can learn from them as Christians. Also, I think it's important to note that these excerpts from Scott Galloway are exactly just that, just portions of a greater conversation with Carey Nieuwhof that we recommend you listen to. Lastly, we know it's a longer one, but we recommend you sticking around to the end, as Andrew and I have a special encouragement for you or the young men in your life. So with all that said, let's jump in. Andrew, man, thanks so much for joining me on today's podcast. How are things going in your neck of the woods, man?
Man, it's a pleasure to be here, and things are going really well in my neck of the woods. I'm really thankful for this season that we're living in. We're praying with a group of guys that we pray with every Wednesday morning, and at the end of prayer, I just felt more hopeful for the church than I ever have. And I don't just say that so yeah, I'm feeling good. I'm feeling excited for the church, and I'm feeling excited about life in Jesus and what's happening around me. So
I love it, man. And just to follow up, I mean, it's been a couple months since we last chatted about your men's prayer group. Are you still doing that, the men's prayer group thing, like every Wednesday?
Every Wednesday, 7 a.m. Faithful. I don't think we've stopped in 2 years.
Come on.
And that's been the gift. It's not over manufactured. We show up. Somebody has a scripture for us to pray through and a theme to pray through. We normally are praying in the context of praying for the local church and the local body through a particular theme. So today was about compassion. And we read from the Gospel of Mark where Jesus had compassion over the crowds. And that's when he multiplied the fish and the bread. And our prayer was that we would have compassion in the way Jesus had compassion over our city here in Milton and broader. And so just every week doing something like that, it's amazing. Cool. It's incredibly life-giving, and God's doing some really cool stuff with and through it. So
I love that. I've been preaching through the parable of the prodigal son at a church here in Milton recently. And the one thing that struck me was that when the son was coming back home, it says the father saw him from a long distance off and had compassion.
Yes.
And I just linking that text between like the father has compassion towards the hurting people, and has compassion towards our cities and has compassion towards men. And today, Andrew, we're talking about young men in particular. And I want to just we're doing something new. We're doing a react video to a podcast that you actually encouraged me to watch. What struck you about this particular interview that made you say, "Hey, Jordan, you should give this a read or give this a watch"?
Yeah, I think what struck me was that first of all, the guest who's being interviewed by Carey is not a follower of Jesus, is a university professor at a State, I think, university. And for him to be, he's basically describing data points that are bringing to life, or at least highlighting an experience that I have working with young adults, young men particularly, and confirming a lot of kind of the sense and the feeling. He confirmed a lot with data that particularly that young men are struggling, and he gave some of his own anecdotes on what to do about that. Carey added to that, and I just thought it's a rich conversation for us to be having, particularly about young men, and relying on all sorts of resources, including secular sociologists, resources and data, in order to tackle the issue of our day, or one of many, but a primary one for us, particularly in the local church, which is how to serve, care for, empower, encourage, and develop and disciple young men well and effectively. So that was kind of the heart behind sending it to you, was like, oh, there's data points to confirm some of our own felt experience and thing that we see on the ground. And then also there's hope there too. There's when you can identify a problem and shine light on it, it also gives you access to tools that can help and vision for solutions, or at least more clarity on what to be praying and asking God for. So,
yeah, it's interesting. Sometimes there's a hesitancy to listen to any secular voices at all when it comes to church and faith. And but at times it can be really helpful, especially if you compare some of this data that is out there, done by people that share a similar concern, maybe even with a different worldview.
Yeah,
that if you pair that with your Christian worldview and what the gospel offers and what Jesus offers, you can come up with some pretty creative solutions to some pretty complex problems. And so on today's podcast, we've got Scott. Well, the video we're watching is Scott Galloway. I wish I had Scott Galloway on our podcast, but he
got me instead.
we got the B team here. But we're going to listen to this conversation between Carey Nieuwhof, who is obviously a legend in the game, a legend in podcasting, and we're just going to react to some of the things that Scott has to say and Carey has to say. From our positions as guys who've worked with young men, who work, I work in a men's ministry, and you're a local pastor, and we've both served in youth ministries, on what we're seeing with young men in comparison to kind of what they're seeing. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to watch this together, Andrew, and feel free to interrupt me or interrupt the video at any time, and we'll just give some commentary on it. And so this will be fun.
Cool.
Let's do it.
Oh, it absolutely isn't. As a matter of fact, I would argue that we have a lot of issues in the U.S., but relatively speaking, the U.S. comparatively, I would argue, has never been stronger. Our GDP growth is incredibly strong, strongest among the G7. Our inflation is the lowest. We created more jobs last year than in any year in history. We're energy independent. We produce more oil than Saudi Arabia or Russia.
Okay, I didn't mean to stop it there, but that's a crazy stat that no one talks about, is that the U.S. produces more oil than Saudi Arabia and Russia. Did you know that?
Yeah, I didn't know that. I knew they produce a lot more than we assume, because we assume that the U.S. is buying from everybody else, but that's just because they need so much. But yeah, they produce a lot. That was surprising me.
I had no idea. And then I looked to see where Canada was. I think we were like a little bit down the list, because I'm like, doesn't Alberta, isn't that like the land of milk and honey? Anyway,
where were we on that list? I'm curious.
I think we were number 4 or 5. I think it was like U.S., Saudi Arabia, Russia, and then I think we were either 4th or 5th. But
probably could be more, but we just do less, I think. But yeah,
I think you're right. All right, let's listen in again. Sorry.
Crazy.
We're the latest technological innovation that's created the GDP of Germany in the last 7 weeks. We entirely own AI. I mean, we're in striking distance of becoming the first really multicultural democracy of this prosperity. And yet we don't like each other. We seem to be raising a generation of Americans that don't like America. They don't feel good about America. The younger generation is the most anxious and depressed on record. And it comes down to what I would call this fairly significant selfishness, as evidenced by a Congress that's the oldest in history, average age 63, that has slowly but surely transferred wealth from young people to old people. The average kind of, silent generation when they were 25 was making on an inflation-adjusted basis at $105,000. We were making about 80, and 25-year-olds right now are making 50. So they have, and then if you look at the things they really need as a younger person or they're saving for, education and housing, those things have exploded in cost. So their purchasing power has gone down, and the things they are saving for and need to get ahead in this world have exploded in cost.
Andrew, what's your thoughts on just some of those things? Anything off the top? I mean, I can jump in. I can start. The one of the shocking things to me was the idea that the U.S. owns AI. How do you own AI? I have no idea what. I have no idea what that means.
I don't know how that works.
But just the fact of,
and control it, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess. I was just thinking about like how he offers such prosperity and promise around on a grand scale and macro scale. Things are going well. Like, there's advancement, there's development, there's new ideas, there's tech coming out of, and again, of course, he's from the US and we're from Canada, so it's a little bit different. But there is things are okay in many ways. But at the same time, there's this other side of like people are not liking each other, was the words he chose.
Yeah, this weekend I was teaching. I just kind of took things back to what the gospel is, and we were talking about the gospel and talking about how like there's a lot of gospels. We have access to more gospels than ever. If gospels is good news, then everybody is sharing their good news formula, their good news strategy, their good news opportunity, their vision for utopia. Like we're inundated with a million different good news stories and testimonies of how our life could be better. And so it's like we have access to the most amount of gospel messages, and we're more anxious than we've ever been. We're less well off relationally than we've been. We're struggling more with all this access, not only to the products, but also to the opportunity, to the vision, to these gospel messages. And it reminded us like, look, there's a good news. There is a gospel, and it's different by nature than all the other ones, because all the other ones are promising wealth and prosperity and opportunity. The gospel that we follow, adhere to, and try to live our life by isn't a gospel of status and wealth and comfort and leisure and pleasure. But it
good.
leads to life and life to the full. And so with all this good news that he's sharing, people are experiencing life and life to the full. Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting reality and dynamic of this particular generation.
Yeah, it's this comparison contrast of economically, it seems like he talks about, the United States is doing well, and I don't know enough about economics and the US to say if he's right or wrong on that. But what's interesting is I think we're seeing the same things here anecdotally, where this, one of the words he said is that we're creating Americans that don't like America, right? And I think in Canada, we're having Canadians that don't like Canada anymore. They don't like how things are working out for them. And that what's interesting about you mentioned that gospel piece. I mean, there's many different ways or truths, or there's many different things that people are saying this is a way to find life, and it's just not adding up for them. Is Scott here is kind of coming from the position or the first principle that like economic success equals flourishing.
Yeah.
Right. And so he's, and I don't necessarily, I can see coming from a non-Christian background why he's tying that things aren't going so well because, young men can't afford houses, or they're not doing as well fiscally. Mm-hmm. What's interesting about the gospel of Jesus is that regardless if the economic position of our country goes up or down, there is still life and life abundant available to people. And so that's the one thing to keep in mind as we're listening, that the gospel, as we'll talk about in a moment, actually transcends if our investments are up and to the right. And
it has the opportunity to do that. And that's what I'm interested in. I was listening to him thinking like, it's probably like double the amount of angst because we're not doing as well financially as the last generation. Like that's never been the solution. But the fact that we're at this generation and the generation coming after us is doing more poorly in that direction than those who have gone before probably exacerbates the anxiety. But the other side of it, Jordan, and I'm excited to continue talking about this with you, is it also is the great opportunity. It's the opportunity for a new way. It's hopeful for me because it's like, well, past generations, his language is like they're basically taking from the young and making the older people in the in societies wealthier, and it's actually coming at the cost of the young, is what Scott's saying. And so like if that's true and that's challenging, but it's also an opportunity for the young to not find their identity and security and hope in the things that maybe the West has idolized in the past, and even the church has maybe pursued and idolized to our own detriment in the past. So it's this weird contrast of it's a tough situation and getting worse and harder at the same time as it actually creates the very kind of environment for hope and opportunity to find meaning in the better gospel story anyway, right?
It's so true, man. Someone once said that like difficult circumstances like he's talking about, and the fact that young men are feeling like they're way further behind than their parents, that's like the black velvet under which like the diamond of the church can shine, right? And it's like the darkness of our financial situation or our prospects actually would point people to the beauty of the local church. And man, we're already like only a few minutes in, and I feel like we're halfway through our time together. So I'm gonna let's keep going. There's so much gold in this, and let's hear what he has to say next.
And this is in the face not only of incredible prosperity, but platforms that remind them every day that they're failing. Oh, you don't have a six-pack? Oh, you didn't make $3 million trading Dogecoin? Oh, you're not staying at the Almond Resort in Utah? You failed. You can't afford an $11,000 Birkin bag. So you have this incredibly anxious generation, and you have the average 70-year-old is 72% wealthier than they were 40 years ago. The average person at the age of 40 is 24% less wealthy. And the incumbents will plead complexity. It's not. These are conscious decisions. 9% cost of living adjustment in Social Security last year, but the child tax credit got stripped out of the infrastructure bill. So I think young people have every right to be upset, and it all leads to the same place. For the first time in our nation's history, the 30-year-old isn't doing as well as his or her parents at 30. That's never happened in our history. And I think it creates rage and shame. And then when you have these shocks, whether it's COVID, whether it's Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movement, which are all what I'll call righteous movements, or the COVID was, a real shock to the system, everything's worse because our most important asset, our young people, feel disenfranchised and quite frankly abused and like they don't have the opportunity their parents had. And I just think it creates rage and shame. And that rage and shame is speedballed by these platforms that remind them of their failure every day.
Incredible. Talking about just all the things we had mentioned earlier, and he uses the language speedballed. Speedballed by these platforms that basically are monetized to make young men question their body image. They're not far ahead. They're not, all these things. And what's interesting is, just on the body image thing real quick, when I was a young man, like when I was a teenager, none of my friends were concerned with getting six packs. Like, I don't know, maybe your friends were, but like none of my friends had six packs. Like not one person. And it's interesting in my working with young men today, it's like very important for them to have a six pack. Yeah. And I'm like, dude, eat craft dinner, man.
Push-ups at youth group and flexing every chance they get. And it's kind of fun and interesting. And I think there's actually something lovely about it. I was saying to someone the other day, like, I feel like half of our youth program is into boxing right now. And I think that's actually, that's a sign of something. And I don't think it's a sign of a bad thing necessarily, but it's an interesting reality where they're into fighting and strength and physique, and they're open about it and they're celebrating it. And it's so interesting.
But it's interesting how like we never had the pressures, you and I, of comparing ourselves to these social medias, and how the constant reminder that they're not where they need to be. That's no surprise to me at all. I've seen that so often. And his language was, young people have the right to be upset. Yeah. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I wrestle with that because, and you and I, where we're at the age that we are, and where we live. We've had conversations about the challenges it is to feel like we did the right things or walk down the path that we were told is is the wise one by both our secular culture and society, our parents, our churches, and we've ended up at a place where we feel financially stuck, unable to do the things that were promised that we'd be able to do at this age if we take the right steps and make good, wise decisions, I guess. And so part of me wrestles with it because he's giving me ammunition to feed my frustration, my annoyance. Right. He's confirming my felt experience, which can turn really easily and quickly into blaming others and the generation who's gone before us and start to moralize it. And I imagine there's moralizing to be done in it, but I wrestle with it because I know the answer is the answer to the way forward, and the answer to healing for me is not to just get angry and blame those who have gone before and start shouting from the rooftops about how selfish of a generation the boomers are or something like that. You know what I mean? Like however true there that is, or there are pieces of that are true, the response, at least the Jesus-like response, is not to get stuck in that, because that's going to just create a cycle of shame and anger and frustration and create more disunity between me and my community. And that's not the way forward. So,
and, when I hear the right to be upset, that's interesting you say those things, because I feel like in this circumstance with young men in particular, no one needs to have a right to be upset because they're just upset, right? Like in the sense that like it's just a natural, and maybe that's kind of what he was hinting at, is that like the cards have been dealt in a way that is not helpful. And you mentioned, doing all the right things. And Carey says later on the podcast, which I don't think we'll hear, but he says the rules have changed. There was once a time that said if you spend less than you make, one day you'll own a house. Well, that's not true anymore. We're playing with different rules, and sometimes it feels like doing the right things, we land in the wrong place. But I agree with what you're saying, that young people have the right to be upset. I think young people have the right to be discouraged, right? To be discouraged, because it is hard. And you and I have talked about that personally, and just for their listeners, Andrew and I are not talking here on this podcast as two guys that own a home that's appreciated several $100,000. We're in a town where we still have to rent, and we've had these conversations honestly of our own frustrations. However, as Andrew said, I don't know, man, like sitting in that is not going to do anyone good. And I did sit in it. I sat in it for a couple of years where I was so mad at Dave Ramsey. Exactly. I was so mad at Dave Ramsey that I paid off all my debt first, and or I was mad at this, or wondering why someone didn't help me, or why I didn't have what's those things when someone dies and you get like an inheritance. I was mad why I didn't have an inheritance, or why I wasn't born a certain way. That doesn't serve anyone well. And if young men need a reason to be optimistic.
Yes.
Right. Rather than a right to be upset, though, I do think they can be. It's reasonable for them to be discouraged.
Yeah, and I think like the answer is, and this is for all generations, we need to look at the plight and the challenge and go, yes, we are, especially where we live. Like there was so much privilege, and we have so much opportunity, and we have so much comfort and leisure, and all those are true, right? At the same time, but it's unhelpful to say to a young man who statistically is doing worse off than the generation previous, if they did all the same things or followed the same wisdom, it's unhelpful to not at least affirm their feeling and confirm, so okay, there's reason for it, instead of just writing it off or blaming it on the individual or moralizing it in any kind of way. I think, rather than just saying you have a right to be upset, maybe rights isn't even the right language. I'm not even sure that's the right language, especially kingdom language, but it makes sense. Humanly makes sense why you would be upset, and the data supports that. So we hear you and we understand whether or not there's an easy solution to it or not. And that's particularly for the older generation to do for the next generation, because they just want to be heard and understood and helped and stuff like that. But first and foremost, it's not blaming them for the plight that they're finding themselves in, and understanding challenge. Things are different, and it is a challenge, and that's okay.
And I think that's why people are attracted to this. They call him Prof G, right? Scott Galloway, because he's one of the few voices that says, you know what, guys, it is difficult. where perhaps there's a lot of talk of saying, well, back in my day when I used to walk to school in a snowstorm, I started
both ways.
uphill both ways, and I made $10,000 a year, right? Like that's often the response I think young men get when around these types of conversations. And so Scott's I guess it's empathy. His empathy and his ability to say, actually, it is difficult is actually very refreshing.
And having data to support it is helpful. It's like, hey, you're anecdotal. You make more money than I did at your age. The data shows actually, I think he said, it's like people in their 70s are doing 40% better than the last generation in their 70s did. And people in their 30s are doing 24% worse than the last generation at 30, right? And so it's like, yes, there's data there. We don't need to, it's true. You know what I mean? It's reality. And it's okay to shine light on it. We don't got to moralize and fight about it. We want to find unity in the midst of it. But let's call a spade, right?
Exactly. And I think that's super refreshing. And so how can we acknowledge that the rules are different, things have changed, but not sit in resentment and blame the people before us? That's the key as a young man. Mm-hmm. It's interesting, Andrew, he touches on what he called shocks to the system. He said, I think it was COVID, Me Too, BLM, these types of things that have happened over the past couple of years that have had significant effects, especially on the younger generation. Why do you think it's had significant effects, especially on the younger generation? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was wondering about that, and I was thinking because in the middle of those movements, there's this righteous indignation that like people are expressing themselves and their angst, and there's a holy or righteous thing to attach it to, and I think they're more significant in the respect that, not to downplay the specifics of each movement, but that young people are using their voice to express a level of angst that they may not even be connected directly to the particular movement, but they're finding their voice, or at least they're finding things to have a voice and express their emotion and frustration, and it's and that's kind of what they're desperate to be heard, and so they're jumping on movements that gives them an opportunity to be heard. But I wrestle with like whether or not that's even the issue at the time. You know what I mean? Like a lot of people,
interesting.
You jump into these, particular movements, and you and I, we've had lots of discussions about them, particularly, especially doing pastoral work in the midst of them. And like there's this complicated, like, don't downplay the goodness and the righteousness that is being called for in that particular movement. But at the same time, like so many people are jumping on board to, I don't want to say like, it's almost like signal their frustration with a lot of things and use that thing to signal it. You know what I mean? And the real answer is like, I think they're just struggling in general with a lot of things, and they're using those as outlets and opportunities, maybe. So,
well, it's interesting because the language that Scott uses around these issues, like the issue of just are young people not doing well, is that it creates rage and shame. And when you're experiencing rage or shame, any avenue for it to be communicated is a chance to be heard. And don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that a lot of these young people don't believe in these movements. I think they do believe in these movements as far as they're concerned, and they want to see justice coming. And it's not just about justice. It's just all sorts of reasons for shocks to the system, as Scott calls it. But I think part of that's true. I think what we're seeing is there are injustices in the world. Young people are being courageous and speaking up about it, but it's also coming from this place of, we have Canadians that don't like Canada. They don't like the world they're in, and not Canada as a nation, just the life that they have. We have people living, and there's this dissatisfaction, there's this hopelessness, there's this fatalism, and I was chatting with someone recently, and this young man, and he talked about not wanting to have kids because because of the world that they would be born into. There's this idea that there's all these shocks to the system that feel like there's no hope on the horizon. And so what happens is this rage and shame that gets built. And I think because there's a blanket of rage in our younger generations, you don't need much of a reason at all to communicate your pain. And I think that's what we're seeing. And I just think that's what we're seeing. But we should keep moving. Any last thoughts before we keep moving? Okay.
No, I think we'll get to more of this. I'm already thinking then what is the church's reaction response to this? Because it's to be the non-anxious presence in the midst of an anxious and growingly anxious online world. And so I'm starting to process that. But let's watch the next clip and continue to think through that.
Yeah, and just for our listeners, and maybe you're thinking, man, this is a lot of talking about the problem. We do talk about solutions at the end. And in this next part in particular, he focuses in on young men in particular, which we'll spend a majority of our time on. And so he talks about kind of, with all these things going on, finance, social shocks to the system, insecurity and anxiety, what's happening to young men in particular. And these stats shocked me. I knew it was pretty harrowing, but I didn't know it was this bad. So let's listen to what he has to say.
You talk a lot about young, lonely males.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to describe a little bit why that's the crisis that not enough people are paying attention to?
There is no group in our society that has fallen further faster than young men. 3 times more likely to be addicted, 4 times more likely to kill themselves, 12 times more likely to be incarcerated, 2.5 times as likely to be homeless. I mean, if you think about, we have a homeless, opiate, suicide problem. Yeah, but what we really have is a male homeless, a male opiate, and a male suicide problem. And unfortunately, because of the advantage that men have had for so long, and it's been such a huge advantage, there really is a lack of empathy for them.
Andrew, what comes to mind, man, as you hear those stats? Are those new to you, or kind of, to me, some of them shocked me? 3 times more likely to be addicted, 4 times more likely to kill themselves, 12 times more likely to be incarcerated, 2.5 more times likely to be homeless.
Yeah, it doesn't shock me. It doesn't surprise me just from what we've seen. And if you've been tracking for the last decade, you may not know the extremity of the numbers, but there's a real clear sense that young men are struggling more and more. And the part that you talked about with the lack of empathy, because of the whole kind of like victimizer kind of economy that we're living in, it does feel like, oh, okay, well, they had so much privilege in the past, like Scott says, so who cares? Everyone else has struggled, so it's about time young men struggled, or something like that. And it's just no way to build a society. It's really dangerous, and it's really unhealthy to do that to anybody. The fall from a position of privilege is a lot harder than having never fallen. And so just to empathize with that and understand that, not necessarily moralize it. And then, the other part of it is like, these are young men who they didn't do anything in the past that has led culture to be where it is, that is resulting in their unique struggle and fall, quote unquote, fall from grace or whatever. They're just young men trying their best, doing what they can, doing what they were suggested to do.
Right.
And so, to look at them and almost sneer at them, or God, who cares how young men are doing? It's like, these are individuals who haven't necessarily done anything wrong, and are struggling more, and it is having a great impact on society. And the stuff that it impacts is far broader reaching than just their own individual lives. It impacts the entire fabric of the society. So we should be more consciously aware of it, and also more sensitive to how we think about it and how we respond to these young individuals who have their own unique life that they're trying to live, and it's as valuable as anyone else's. You know what I mean?
Yeah. The whole thought of no group in society has fallen faster than young adult males, and his comment about because of the privilege that they've had, there's a lack of empathy. And I think just now there's beginning to be more conversations about men struggling, whereas 2 years ago it's like you weren't allowed to say that men were actually struggling. Like to say that there was a young men crisis to kind of be ignorant to the pain that maybe men have caused in the past. However, this is where a guy like Scott Galloway is really helpful from a secular perspective, because he brings data to the table that says, actually, we do have an issue with our young men and they are struggling. And so, and he uses language, and I'm sure we'll hear it in a moment. It's not a zero-sum game. By talking about, men struggling, we're not saying women aren't struggling, and we're not trying to take away from the advancement that we've seen in women's rights and those types of things. We're not acknowledging that a lot of these things needed fixing, and that there was actually something called toxic masculinity. It does exist, right? But at the same time, ignoring men or saying they are not struggling or not being empathetic towards them, like you said, has consequences on society as a whole. And you begin to see this where he goes on to say, actually, I'll play it. He goes on to talk about how like men are losing morale when it comes to the dating realm and family makeup, and we're seeing less households form. Men are maturing later, and let's hear what he has to say on that.
Young men are just struggling. They're confused in the dating market. They're graduating. It used to be 40-60 female to male college graduation. It's flipped. It's about to go 2-1 because men drop out at a greater rate. And it has real impact because on our society, because women mate horizontally and up economically, men horizontally and down. And so when the pool of viable mates in the eyes of women gets smaller and smaller, you have less household formation. And now you have women dating much older because they want to date an economically and emotionally viable male. And so what do you have? You have a young man that doesn't have the same economic prospects as dad has. He has a series of algorithms and companies trying to segregate him from society to convince him that he doesn't need a relationship, he just needs porn. He doesn't need work, he just needs Coinbase and Robinhood. He doesn't need friends, he just needs Reddit and Discord. And I would say of all the people I hear from on this topic, the ones I hear from the most and the most supportive are mothers. And it goes something like this. I have 3 kids, 2 daughters, 1 son. One daughter's at Penn, the other daughter's in PR in Chicago, and my son's in the basement vaping and playing video games. On any metric, young men are doing worse and have fallen further faster than anyone. And I want to be clear.
Interesting, eh?
Yeah.
Interesting, eh? And I think actually in this next moment, he talks about the zero-sum game, which I think is important for people, our listeners, to hear as well. So let's hear this, and then we'll jump in.
Empathy is not a zero-sum game. Women still face a lot of struggles. Their progress is fantastic, and we should do nothing to get in the way of that progress. More single women own homes now than single men. It's great that they're in home ownership. It's great that there's college attendance. So my solutions always go to more, not a zero-sum game where we in any way slow down the remarkable progress. But there's just no getting around it. We're creating a generation of millions of young men who are lonely, and not economically or emotionally viable. And there is nothing more dangerous than a lonely, broke young man.
Wow. Man, there's there's so much in there that it just in that we could have done a whole podcast on this clip in general. A few things stuck out to me was just around dating. I did some research on this, and one of the stats I found is that 66% of young men between 18 and 29, 66, so 2/3 of young men between 18 and 29 are single, but only 34% of women in the same age are single. And so it's as if almost double the amount of women are in relationships in that age than there are men. And so it's like, what is going on? How does that work? Who are they in relationship with? Well, they're in relationship with 30 plus. And why is that?
And fewer and fewer guys. It's fewer and fewer guys are now seen as suitable mates, and so it's fewer and fewer guys. So this is because at the end of the day, like for the most part, women choose their partner, and there's all sorts of biological reasons for that. But because of the change in social dynamics, a lot women are still dating, but they're dating a smaller pool of guys because there's a smaller pool that seems suitable compared to where they're at. Is kind of what Scott's saying. Which
anecdotally,
leads to the Sorry, what were you saying?
Anecdotally, and the friends that I have that are single, female friends that Rachel and I have, that's their experience. Is they're having a hard time finding a guy within their age demographic that is on their feet. and launched into a career or has direction, and so guys are becoming demoralized, and he talks about how like the social platforms are telling them they don't need relationships, they need porn. They don't need a job. They just need Coinbase and crypto, and they don't need friends. They just need Discord. And I thought, this is interesting. This is an interesting outcome to a digital age we live in, and perhaps the greatest opportunity in all this, I think, for the local church.
Yeah.
Any thoughts around that porn and crypto and Discord?
Oh man, it's so spot on to experience. I remember. It was like a few months ago, I was talking to someone, and it was the third, and I don't want to say this too casually, but it's kind of the third person who I respect them as parents and their involvement in the local church, who I learned they had a son who lives at home, never leaves, doesn't go outside, has social anxiety. They don't really know what they do. They're in their mid-20s. They play video games, and that's it. And to me, like every young man who I imagine having such levels of social anxiety that they can't get outside their home, I panic. I think that's really, really scary and dangerous. And then to hear more and more stories, like that's the norm. And these parents are like, I guess that's just what young men are doing. It's like, it's heartbreaking. It's terrifying. And like Scott said, like it's actually dangerous. And we don't want to be alarmists about things, because we probably shouldn't be. It's not all that helpful to just be an alarmist all the time. But the truth is, and I've been saying this for a long time, I know you've been saying this, like the most dangerous thing is a young man who's bored. I mean, young men who are bored do wacky things or involve themselves in wacky things, right? You know what I mean? And I know what I'm like when I'm bored, right? Like the saving grace in my life is having a vision, an opportunity, and things to pursue, and a family to take care of, and a ministry to steward. Because without all that, yeah, dude, it's dangerous. So.
And it's interesting, because what I love about the cultural moment we live in right now, in some ways, is that there's a lot of people trying to get guys out of the basement. Like on Instagram right now, if you're a man and you don't see men telling you to take responsibility for your life, I'm shocked, because there's so many there's influencers. But what happens is this message of like, take responsibility for your life and own your life, take ownership. It so quickly goes crazy when you have the same people that are saying these things kind of spew misogynistic stuff, violence or machismo or macho. And it's like, where are the moderate voices? And they go on to talk about where are the moderate voices that talks about, like, actually you can get out of the basement without having to climb Everest, right? Like you can get out of the basement and actually just be a humble, charitable, Jesus-centered man that defends the weak, that looks out for people, that takes their life into their own hands and submits himself to a cause. But you don't need to go nuts. And so it's interesting how, like, oftentimes guys are holding on to these platforms, and maybe they know, I need to do better, I need to get out of the basement, I need to just pull up my socks and get on with things. But they're drawn sometimes to the most outlandish voices. And
I don't know if you want to name them, but I'll name it and you can cut it if you want. But it was like a little while ago, I'm talking to a group of young Christian guys who have great influences and father figures around them, and they're celebrating Andrew Tate as like the voice for the generation. And I'm like, he's saying a few things that young men have been desperate to hear said, which are good things. But he's not the model. He's living a totally anti-God, anti-Christ life. It's not a good example. It's just filled with misogynistic abuse. And it's like, but they're gravitating towards that and asking me my opinion on figures like that. And I'm like, why don't we just stick with Jesus? Because Jesus said all the good things and invited you into the life that's the good life without all that moral stuff, Or there's other examples like your own dad or your own local pastor, or other voices who are living a pretty relatively like moral life. Like I've pointed young guys towards like a Jordan Peterson who has a family and has stayed married to the same person and didn't get wealthy off of pimping girls out on OnlyFans. You know what I mean? And so that's exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing them swing towards these voices. They're never going to be those guys. So they're just going to be left in a deeper ditch of shame because they won't become that. and nor should they, because of the moral reality of a life lived like that. And you're right, the language of where's the moderate voice that's inviting them into, calling them to a higher way, calling them to responsibility, but like local grassroots, like communal responsibility. Yeah. Embodied stuff. Yeah. And like,
I think part of it is, I think part of it, these young men don't realize that they're actually the currency and the tools that these extreme voices need to use to build their own platform, right?
To
get wealthier. And so they know that the more extreme things they say, the more clicks that they get, right?
Yes.
And so these young men, they're not actually, a lot of times, these influencers and Tate in particular, I don't think they actually have a concern for young men as much as they do sometimes their own platform. And so and you mentioned, like, why can't we just point people to Jesus? And, I think ultimately, man, we have not offered the person of Jesus, who was an embodied human male, as an image of masculinity, well in the church, right? And we've often talked about how, we don't talk a lot about Jesus as a man, and how for young men, he is someone to look up to as a good example of masculinity.
Yes.
Right. In so many ways that,
the idea that Jesus is the lion and the lamb embodied in one, like that image. And when you break down that metaphor, like that is such a beautiful, proper, healthy, fulfilling version of masculinity. And that's the healthy balance of the two. And like you're saying, it's almost like there's this overemphasis on almost like the feminine spirit and the lamb thing, and then the reaction back is towards like the lion thing. We even see this in eschatology. I don't know how much you want to get into this. You can probably cut this. But like eschatological views of Jesus, like there's almost this heightened sense of, Jesus is going to come back on a white horse with a sword and kill all of his enemies, and it's like, that's not, but it's again, it's a reaction, a response to something. So we're jumping to this extreme, to this kind of lion figure. And what we don't want to do is leave the lamb. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
So Jesus embodies healthy, balanced masculinity in a really deep and profound way. We could spend our whole life meditating on that, but we're not doing a good job with that.
No, and I think we'll touch on this a little bit more in a moment in regards to Jesus as an example of healthy masculinity, in fact, ideal masculinity. And what I love about this conversation that Carey has with Scott is that he doesn't, and the word Carey uses, problematize. And I think sometimes it's easy. I know, Andrew, you and I can talk all day about the problems with, anything. But Scott offers some unique solutions to this. Yes. And again, for our listeners, remember that Scott is not coming from a Christian background, but I like that he has actual solutions to the problems he's talking about. And so let's listen to some of them, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts on them, and then we'll jump in.
So some of the programs around young men, redshirt them, start them a year late in kindergarten. A lot of this is from Richard Reeves' work. Men just mature more slowly. The prefrontal cortex doesn't develop as fast. Make them a year older than the girls in their grade. More vocational class. Let's bring back wood shop, metal shop, auto shop. Let's do a grand bargain with our great public universities, where instead of bailing out people with student loans, let's take $500 billion, 500 biggest universities, on average, size adjusted $1 billion each, in exchange for the following things. You grow your freshman class 6% a year, you reduce costs 3% a year, and 20% of your certification goes to vocational programs, especially nursing, piping, plumbing, whatever it might be, auto repair, EV, HVAC, energy efficient installation and repair. There's a ton of those jobs out there that in 10 years doubles the size of freshman classes and cuts the cost in half. Let's flip our tax system. 37% top for capital gains, 22% top for current income. Who makes their living from buying and selling assets and stocks? People my age. Who makes it from current income? Our kids' age. There's no reason money is more noble than sweat. That just makes no sense to tax money at a lower rate than to tax sweat. Let's do away with mortgage tax interest. Who owns homes? Older people. Who rents? Younger people. Let's have a negative income tax. You make less than $50,000, we give you money. Let's have a child tax credit. It's just absolutely no excuse that the world's wealthiest nation should have 1 in 5 households with children are food insecure. I think we need to age-gate social media, no phones in schools. We need to attack the problems of depression and anxiety. And then finally, if I were to pick one thing I'd want to implement it right away, it would be mandatory national service. In Israel, they don't have nearly the level of teen depression. Kids in the populace feels much better about their nation. And I think it's because they've all served in the agency of something greater than themselves, and they've had the chance to make friends, mentors, meet mates, co-founders of businesses, all serving in uniform together. And they get along. They respect each other. They don't, if you look at the great legislation of the 60s and 70s, the Great Society in America, a lot of it was because Democrats and Republicans had both served in the same uniform together.
Wow. So there's a ton in there, Andrew, but some of the ones that stuck out to me, man, was starting guys a year later in kindergarten. I thought that was hilarious because it's so funny when you get to high school, the drastic difference of maturity between young men and young boys and young girls. It's just striking. I'm like, hey, I don't know all the implications of that, but to me, I'm like, you wouldn't even notice the difference other than like, maybe guys would be a little bit. I'm laughing because it's just so
You're
evident.
Picturing it in real time and from your experience in youth ministry, I'm picturing it now, even in the faces of our own students here. Yeah.
And then he talked about more wood shops, metal shops back in school. I mean, there's a huge focus on tech in schools right now, which I think is good because tech obviously is the future, but it comes at a cost, right? Where all their life is online. And so getting guys working with their hands again. I mean, we live in Ontario, Andrew, and when I came to Ontario and saw that some schools had an auto shop, like I went to a school that had none of that, right? And so I hope we don't lose that and just put all of our eggs in tech.
Yeah.
That would be a shame.
It would be a shame. Yeah. Well, we can't afford to lose it because
That's right.
Robots aren't building houses and fixing toilets. And those are traditionally male dominated industries. Yeah. So we can't afford to lose it. The thing is, how do we incentivize men to pursue that avenue rather than the tech one? I remember like 7 or 8 years ago, it was like every other male student that was graduating from my youth program was going to computer science. And that was new because like maybe the odd person from my generation graduating was going to do computer science. It was kind of like the new next thing. Now it's like everyone is doing it. Even the kids who are like this, tall, strapping athlete who, like, I just thought the last person you picture sitting behind a computer screen all day coding. And that's what he was interested in because of the opportunity, And so the incentive structure, it pushes young men in that direction. And young men thrive in those kinds of spaces because of the hours it takes and the work it takes. But the problem, like you said, is it's just more time in front of the screen.
The other thing he said that I wish we had more time to talk about, man, this has been really fun today, is age gating social media, not allowing young teens to get social media until a certain age. To me, you could make that change tomorrow and not one mature adult would probably complain about that. Like, no. I feel like the jury has decided that social media has kind of made a generation anxious. The data set shows it. And so to me, that is the easiest thing you can do by mandating an age gate to social media that would have the most drastic change. And I'm hoping that happens in the next couple of years. I don't know if you see that as a possibility.
Dude, I've been thinking about that recently. We're thinking about in a year from now doing like a social media fast as a church, or at least saying, hey, on behalf of the church, I'm not going to be on it. We're not posting on social media because you have to get radical about it in order to change culture. I have a friend who did that in Columbus, Ohio, and he's been saying only positive things about it for the sake of their community. But the thing is, what you need to do is you need to have a social structure in place to facilitate that. We've set up an economy where our social engagements are there, and you can't just strip people from their primary social engagement and spaces for primary social engagements. You have to have an alternative that their social network is actually a part of, or at least connected to, or agree that they're going to use. Otherwise, you're just robbing them from the only lifeline to social interaction that we've created for them. And that's where I think the church comes in, man. I'm seeing this with youth on Fridays. Like, we're having students once in a while just put their phones down and be present with one another. And it's been lovely. It's a struggle for some, but it's like, if they all know everyone's doing it, then they'll do it. They'll do whatever they're told, as long as there's new spaces they're created for. And we as a church, I think we need to be the people who are radically embodied. We've talked about being hyper local, Jordan, and radically embodied so that we're getting those social and emotional needs met outside of the online world. And that leads to, it's leading this generation already. It seems as though those who are experiencing that are just kind of like, well, I don't really need that. I don't really want that. I don't want to be consumed by that as much anymore. And so it's not, as simple as age gating it right away.
Yeah, it's true. That's true.
We desperately need to move in that direction. And then we need to build the infrastructure to facilitate the social and emotional needs when we do that, because I think we ought to.
Well, it's amazing, man. That, for me, I'm like, I see it as such a critical thing. I'm like, cut it off at the root. But meanwhile, you'd have people that like legit don't have any other friends outside their social media. Well, just as we're talking here, Andrew, I kid you not, I texted a previous student of mine. He's probably 18 or 19, maybe even 20 now. He had his grandparents took the grandchildren to Portugal to walk the Camino. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Camino. It's like this long walk that you can do over several weeks if you want. It's supposed to be a pretty transformative experience. It's like it's just supposed to be pretty meaningful. And so these grandparents took their grandchildren, who are all teenagers now. And I think some of the rules were to not have your phone and stuff like this. And so I just texted him this morning, not thinking about this conversation at all. I said, "Hey dude, how was the walk?" And he said, "Yo, Jordan, what's up?" He said, "It was actually really great. It gives you a lot of clarity being disconnected from reality like that. You're on your phone less, talking with people from all around the world. And I talked a lot with my grandpa, which is always great. We should meet up soon to discuss."
Wow.
And I thought that is a picture of a solution that if we could get kids off their phones, and there's all sorts of resources and books out there and podcasts that you can listen on this. We don't need to talk about why it's needed, but you have experiences like my friend Jackson, who's just said, it gives you a lot of clarity. Man, I just think young men will begin to come out of their basements more, though that's not applicable to Jackson, but if they could just get maybe some real embodied experiences. Now, his last thing is this, Andrew, is mandatory national service. And this is kind of probably like a fire nest to go around, but it's interesting that the language he uses is that young men need to have a cause really to die for, right? Like under something higher than themselves, he talks about. And I'm thinking, Prof G, man, Scott, you're almost there. Like you are so close to the kingdom, like Nicodemus. You're saying it without saying it. Listen, man, and the answer is not military. The answer is laying down your life for the sake of the king, not for country, though that can have good benefits. A young man can climb out of find purpose in laying his life down for the king and King Jesus. And this is what the church offers young men, that we need to say, listen, we have something worth dying for. We have a cause. We have ground to take. We have something that is beautiful and magnificent and is life-giving more than anything that is behind a screen, more than anything that you're struggling with. The gospel of Jesus Christ is worth dying for. And I feel like we've got to do a better job at communicating that no matter where you look or what you're looking for, that Jesus is better. And not because it's like good music, not because there's some guy on a stage saying good things. It's that Jesus offers what you can't find anywhere else: life and life abundant. And I just thought, Scott, you're so close. You're so close, but yet so far.
And he's spot on about the need for liminal spaces where men are fighting a battle together, are waging war together. The problem with it is, again, it's through the economy of power. And that doesn't lead to the kingdom of God and life to the full. It just leads to destruction, disunity, and death. Even if it brings some guys together, the end result is actually not the kingdom. The real war, we were praying about this morning, talking about this morning after prayer, like the real war, every time I want to get involved in a battle and a war, like I want to fight something. And you and I as men particularly, like, you hear about something that happened and you want to go and you want to fight that battle. You want to advocate for that person. You want to show up to that teacher and put them in their place. You want to say that thing to that politician. You want to go talk to that businessman who ripped somebody off. Like you want to just get in the game, and maybe there's space for that at times. But the reality is, like, the actual war and battle that we're fighting is with flesh, is with our own flesh. And it's like, if we can empower young men together in spaces, embodied spaces, to actually wrestle with the real war against the real enemy, which is Satan, demons, and the flesh, is at least the language of the New Testament, which is really like the battle with your own self. And and becoming the new creation that Jesus says that you are, that's the best battle. That's a lifelong adventure, and that's what will change you, and that's what will change the world around you. It really is grassroots, and we as the church are the only ones capable of offering that, inviting anybody into that, because it's God's kingdom.
It's so true, man. And I think we've thrown out the baby with the bathwater on this a little bit, because we've been afraid to use fighting language, and especially military language, around the kingdom principles, and mainly because for a long time, it was weaponized against culture rather than the real enemy, which was Satan and his minions, right?
Yes,
and so for a long time we're like, well, let's not use military language with guys because they get weird and they get kind of. But the truth is this: that you can't get away of warfare in the spiritual realm in the scriptures, and it's useful language and it's biblical language. I think about in 2 Timothy, where the writer says, "Endure suffering along with me as a good soldier of Christ Jesus." Mm-hmm. Soldiers don't get tied up in the affairs of civilian life or civilian affairs, for they cannot please the officer who enlisted them. And what we're seeing in the world, and I heard John Tyson speak on this before, is you've got a bunch of young men who are just engaging in civilian affairs.
Yes,
right? Not necessarily even sin, just silly, stupid things that are distracting them from the real cause, which is being a good soldier for Jesus. And that's could be, to some listening, if you're not a believer, you're like, man, that sounds like really cringy language. But the truth is this: that actually, I like how John Eldridge said this, that like if you live in a world at war, spiritual attack must be a category you think in, or you will misunderstand more than half of what happens. And he's talking about marriage.
Yes.
And I say all that to say, I don't want our churches to throw out the language of spiritual battle, of warfare, because I honestly believe in some ways young men grow when that is proposed as to what that battle actually is, correctly is.
Yeah,
it's not a culture war. It's to be
it's not
the
us
person
versus them. It's not Christianity versus another religion or atheism. It's not that. It's actually, and this is the beauty. If you describe it, everyone experiences it. It's the battle within you when your temptation is to lust and to watch porn. It's the battle within you when you're tempted to just gorge out on food instead of actually living a relatively healthy lifestyle. It's the battle within you that just doesn't want to do the hard thing that is morally good and beneficial to the community. It's the battle within you, the rage that's within you, the anger that's within you that just kind of sparks up because somebody said something to you the wrong way. Like the war we need to fight, the battle we need to fight is against that. And that's the biblical language, is the flesh. That's your own flesh. And we do that together. It's not about Christians getting together and wearing the same clothes to go fight them. Exactly. The New Testament is so clear that it's about powers and principalities, not individuals, not nation states, now, of course, powers and principalities control nation states and people groups, and that causes a lot of death and destruction in the world. And so that's the complexity and the nuance of mandatory service. And you can fall on whatever side of that debate that you want, and it should be honored and respected in some kind of way. But the truth is we all have the same shared experience of a battle, which is with our own flesh and our own nature. Yeah. And that's what the New Testament's all about. It's about waging war against that, which is described as Satan and demons and principalities and rulers and stuff like that. So,
and I think men could die for that. There's an old story, and I'll probably finish off with this. There's an old story about Sparta, as Sparta being kind of a community outside of Greece, I believe it was. And what happens was that they were sending out messengers to these small communities of basically saying like, hey, surrender your towns or we're going to take over your town, right? And when they got to Sparta, they realized that Sparta had no walls. It was the only community that had no walls. And apparently the messenger said to the kind of commander of the military, give us your town or we're going to come in and siege it. And he said, and you guys don't have walls, right? So you guys don't stand a chance. Well, what's interesting is the commander of Sparta pointed to the men, the army of Sparta, and said, we are the wall. We are the wall. And I think we need to remind young men again that they are actually the wall around their life, that they actually have a responsibility to the people around them, not in some over machismo, masculine, violent person, but what it is that they actually are the wall that is going to allow their communities, their families to thrive and flourish. For the people around them to feel safe. I think about the person of Jesus and how he made people that were vulnerable feel safe. Like that's not a wrong thing to say about men, that men can protect vulnerable people around them.
It's our role and our calling. It's one of the primary ones. Yeah.
And so men, you're the wall. You have the opportunity to be the wall for our societies and our families and our churches and our communities. And we need you to rise. We need you to rise up, men. And your community needs you to rise. And so hear that today.
It's the best adventure you can experience. It's the best use of your life. Like, I mean that, like, from my own experience, when I'm operating that role and sacrificing to that end, it's the best. There's nothing more meaningful. There's nothing more powerful in my own life. And there's nothing more life-giving than when I'm operating in that role. And so hear it from me, at least, and hear it from Jordan, like, it is worth it. It is the main thing. It is the best thing. And yeah, we're all called to that and invited into that.
Yeah, the scriptures say, young men, if you want to find your life, you will need to lose it. And we want to invite you to lose it and lay it down at the feet of King Jesus today. We hope this has been a blessing to you. Man, it was fun to react, actually. I don't know how you enjoyed that, but it was fun to react to this, and just would encourage you to go on to listen to the rest of that podcast. There's some brilliant stuff in there around, from an atheist perspective, what the local church can add to society and how they can grow. So anyway, Andrew, thanks for being with us today, man. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's been fun. Thanks, Jordan.
See you, man.